What's up, everyone? I'm Ethan. I'm here with my boy Garrett,
What's going on?
and welcome to HIVE Sports, where we talk all things NFL and college football. Today, we're going to be going over what we think the second round of the 2026 Dynasty SuperFlex Rookie Draft should look like.
And again, this is not a mock draft per se. It's not our personal selections or our personal rankings, but this is what we expect the second round to look like next year as of right now. Current values, current projections of guys next year. There's still a lot of uncertainty, there's still a lot of, even with whether a guy will declare next year, there's still some uncertainty with that. And then, obviously there's the, a lot of transfer movement with the current NIL landscape. That's definitely another wild card of how these players are going to adjust to their new program. So a lot of things that make it a difficult projection, but it's a fun exercise. And, it's definitely going to help you guys, I think, in the dynasty marketplace, making informed trades with future draft picks.
100%. And if you're looking for our round one 2026 Dynasty Superflex Rookie Draft, check out our other videos so you can be fully informed for all of your 2025 Dynasty trades.
Yep, and all those links will be in the description below, so feel free to check it
All
out.
right, let's get into it. Garrett, start us off with the 201.
All right, 201, it's going to be Jordan Tyson's young teammate, the quarterback out of Arizona State, Sam Leavitt, a guy who we saw make an impressive jump last year in his redshirt sophomore season. And you know what? I expect him to take another jump next season with Jordan Tyson returning nice and healthy. Cam Scottaboo is gone, so you got to expect them to run the ball a little bit less, to also kind of lean on Sam Leavitt a little bit more, I think.
Yeah.
Right.
And I think Sam Levitt's a guy that made a big jump last season, and a lot of people are expecting him to make an even bigger jump this next season, especially as kind of the main leader of the team with Jordan Tyson, right? Like there is no Cam Scottaboo, so it's going to be Tyson and Sam Leavitt, and there's already also talks of him being in the Heisman, conversation. So definitely some high expectation for him, and a guy that could maybe sneak into the first round. Going to 202 is a guy that I'm high on, Eric Singleton, wide receiver. He transferred from Georgia Tech. Now he's at Auburn with Jackson Arnold. So going to have a cool situation there at Auburn where they're bringing in some talented transfers. He's a guy that produced 2 years in a row at Georgia Tech. Big time playmaking ability, especially against some good defenses. He performed well against Georgia and other SEC defenses. He's a guy that is a smooth route runner, and I just have notes of him, and I just think of stud when I think of Eric Singleton. So really, really excited to see what he does at Auburn this next season. And I know Auburn's going to try to make that jump up and be a lot better than they have been. So I think Eric Singleton will be a big part of that if they do. So he's going to be my pick at 202.
Love it. Now you broke it down really well, and I think Eric Singleton, I mean, the NIL market agrees with you that he's a stud. He was paid pretty well, in the open market, and so that's a good selection for the early second round, I think. And another guy who could really sneak into the early second next year is John Mateer, the quarterback who transferred from Washington State to Oklahoma now. Can he maintain his Washington State form? Because if so, I mean, that's a clear late first, early second, super flex pick at the worst, because he is very impressive last year, and he did have Kyle Williams at his disposal, but he still has Deion Burks and some other nice weapons at Oklahoma. Got Jaden Ott in the transfer, window as well. So Oklahoma's making some moves. They had a lot of departures in the transfer window, but they also got some nice arrivals. So it'll be interesting to see what John Mateer can do heading into next year.
Yeah, and we've seen another big name from Washington State transfer to a bigger school and produce in Cam Ward last season. So definitely excited to see what John Mateer does at Oklahoma. Moving to 204, I'm gonna go with the long, lanky receiver out of USC, Jacoby Lane. He's a guy that was just a red zone target for them. I mean, I think over 25% of his receptions were for touchdowns last year. With some departures in the wide receiver room, it's really going to be Jacoby Lane and Makhi Lemon, who should be taken over as the 1-2 options at the wide receiver position. And it's funny how Makhi Lemon and Jacoby Lane are just like opposites, Makhi Lemon being the smaller slot, quick receiver, and Jacoby Lane just being that long red zone threat that he is. So I know NFL teams love a big-bodied wide receiver. He's a little bit lanky and could put on some more size, but he's a guy that I think could be a really big weapon in the red zone for an NFL team.
Yeah, he's the above the rim guy, right? And he can definitely get high and high point the ball well, and he's an exciting talent. And you saw that breakout bowl game. I think that could be a preview of what's to come when he had over 100 yards and 2 touchdowns. So it'll be interesting to see if he can build on that performance. At 205, I think that we currently expect it to be Makhi Hughes, the running back transfer from Tulane to Oregon. I mean, this guy had huge production as a freshman and sophomore at Tulane. So it'll be interesting to see how he transfers over to a bigger school in Oregon, but I think we expect him to be the workhorse just right away, and Jordan James has departed to the NFL, for the San Francisco 49ers. So Makhi Hughes is stepping into a lot of opportunity in that backfield, and you saw the talent. So, I mean, I expect him to be a top 2 round guy next year in superflex drafts, and probably, maybe a round 3 guy. What do you think, E? In the NFL draft?
Yeah, I could see that. And he's a guy that I think could really climb based on whether the scheme at Oregon fits him. He produced really well at Tulane, but really curious to see how Dan Lanning uses him, especially when you have, explosive athletes around him. You have Dante Moore at quarterback, Decorian Moore, Kenyon Sadiq, who I'm sure we'll talk about later on. So really curious to see how Makhi Hughes jumps into that RB1 at Oregon, whether he, takes the reins as the lead back or whether they use it back by committee. But definitely excited to see what he does, because if he produces well and he's uses the talent that we saw at Tulane, I think he's a guy that could also rise on those boards.
For sure. Who you got at
206, I'm going to go with Singleton's companion, Kaytron Allen. He's a guy that I think is slept on. I mean, he had more rushing attempts last season than Nick Singleton, so clearly Penn State values him as a runner. Not as big of a receiving threat as Nick Singleton, so I don't know if he has that receiving upside, and so that's why he's a little bit less or a little bit down in our rankings. But he's a guy that is just big, stout, and aggressive runner, and has produced year after year that he's at Penn State. And I mean, he's been a significant part of the Penn State rushing attack. So he's a guy that I think will go in the middle of the second round of a Dynasty Rookie Draft in 2026.
Yeah, and I think he's just one of those guys who's maybe better for real life football than he is for fantasy, if that makes sense. And I think he's going to be better for his NFL team than he is for your fantasy team, just because of what you mentioned, Ethan, with the lack of receiving ability. And he's just more of like a tone setter than he is a fantasy producer. So
especially in a full PPR league, right? Like, full PPR, those receptions are really important. And as a guy that, it's not like he didn't catch the ball at all at Penn State, but he, doesn't necessarily have that receiving upside, I think. He is that tone setter, the guy that you're like, hey, 3rd and 1, I want him in there. Or if I'm trying to, set the tone early on in a game, like, let's hand the ball up to Kaytron Allen a few times and let him just like knock helmets off guys,
Oh, 100%. At 2-7, you teased it a little bit earlier. It's going to be another Oregon player by the name of Kenyon Sadiq, and he's a guy who's just a freak athlete, man. And we're seeing it in spring ball already. The journalists are just losing their mind over how athletic this guy is, and you saw it last year with the on-field athleticism score. The PFF had him in the 99th percentile for his size. So he's a guy who moves very well out there, and I think he's going to be a top tester at the NFL Combine if he chooses to participate, and he's a guy who I think we both see as a riser, and, he could definitely even go higher than this in next year's Dynasty SuperFlex drafts.
Yeah, and definitely in a tight end premium league, I think he's a guy that could really rise because he just has the attribute. His athleticism is off the charts. People are raving how he's more athletic than Brock Bowers and how he's just like this freak of nature and his physique is crazy. So really excited to see, him as the tight end 1 there at Oregon with Dante Moore throwing on the ball. A guy that I think is probably too low on our list, and he's a guy that I think will be moving up in the near future. I have a feeling, but it's gonna be Denzel Boston, wide receiver out of Washington. I mean, big bodied, 6'4" frame, 200+ pounds. And he's a guy that, like, oftentimes you see these taller, bigger bodied wide receivers just being kind of those jump ball specialists or, being those red zone threats. But he's a guy that has some really good movements or really good moves after he catches the ball. I mean, his yak is impressive for somebody so big. He's a guy that can, lower his shoulder, but also put out a spin move, stiff arm and really make people miss. So I like the combination of not only being a big body that can catch the ball at a high point, but also a guy that can catch the ball, across the middle of the field and still make some yards after the catch.
Yeah, I think he's just a very complete, physical wide receiver. And you broke it down really well. I know he's your boy, and we both expect him to be a riser and to go in the second round of Dynasty SuperFlex Rookie drafts next season. And another late second wide receiver we expect to go right around this range is Aaron Anderson, the incoming wide receiver one for LSU this season. And like you mentioned, one of the wide receiver U's and a great school. If you're a helmet scout and you like to just pay attention to these schools on their helmets, that would be your top guy in the class. So based on that, and also he's a talented guy, right? I don't want to sit here and just act like he's getting the honorary mention because he's an LSU receiver. He's a talented guy. He's a very good slot receiver. He's quick. He's shifty. He shows good speed. He shows that route running ability, the understanding, how to sit in those soft spots of zone defenses. And he's a guy, he's very impressive. Could even go higher than this. You never know. But I think the second round is a pretty good range to expect him to go. And, if you have a late second round rookie pick, you expect your team to be competitive, you can kind of expect to be able to get a guy like Aaron Anderson in this range, which is, it's not too shabby
Yeah,
for this
really
class
good
as a
value.
whole.
Really good
Yeah.
value as a guy that's going to be Nussmeier's, safety blankets. Moving to 210, go another tight end, Eli Stowers out of Vanderbilt. He's a guy that just has amazing ball skills. I mean, him and Diego Pavia are just like a really strong connection. He was their leading receiver as a tight end last season. I think he moved from wide receiver to tight end, actually put on a little bit of size, but he's a guy that transferred with Diego Pavia too from New Mexico State. So they had a lot of good chemistry. Just a big body tight end who has some sneaky athleticism as well, but also just like has a knack for catching the ball in those awkward positions. And I know that when Vandy needs, a big play, Eli Stowers is the guy that Diego Pavia is looking for. So he's a guy that I think will definitely shake some heads this next season. And in a tight end premium league, having a guy that just has really good ball skills and has good yards after the catch when the ball's in his hands is really valuable.
Yeah, I mean, tight end premium, super flex. This is a guy you want to keep your eye on, and he's a freak athlete. Him and Kenyon Sadiq, I think, have the potential to form a very nice 1-2 punch at tight end, in next year's
100%.
class. So I really like the pick there. Another guy that I think is going to go in this late second range is Nico Iamaleava, and I think you could even be a riser. I know we're saying this about like all these guys, so not everyone's going to be a riser, but a lot of these guys have the potential to be risers if they have a strong season next year. So that's obvious. But Nico was a highly rated recruit, highly rated prospect coming out of high school, and he really hasn't done a whole lot to dissuade, the believers. And I think he gets a little bit overhated, right? Because of all the off the field stuff, people want to act like this guy is some kind of bum, but he's a very good college quarterback. And I know he didn't have the greatest game against Alabama in that college football playoff game last year, but they lost Dylan Sampson, and he had very little to work with at wide receiver. So, I mean, I thought he put the team on his back pretty well, and he was running the ball, he was taking a lot of hits, but he just didn't care, and he showed off that toughness too. So people want to act like he's a diva or a prima donna because he wanted more NIL money, but to me that's just people being haters and not really understanding the business of being a student athlete.
Yeah, and I mean, 6'6" frame, in that last game, I think he had like 20 plus carries. So he has that rushing upside as well, which we like to see. But I mean, he's a guy that was a highly touted recruit out of high school, and it shows. I mean, he has great touch on his ball, but can also put some zip in the window when he needs to. And I mean, I think he has the perfect frame to put some muscle on as well. So I think the NIL stuff has really made, people kind of have a sour taste about him, but the talent's there, and like there's no NIL issues in the NFL. Like it's a new issue and something that I think will iron itself out in the future. But the talent is there, and I think he's a guy that it will be a steal at the end of the second round.
Yeah,
But
and especially, I just want to jump in real quick. If he can elevate that UCLA offense, people are. I mean, that's a big reason why his stock's down right now is because of that transfer, obviously. But if he can elevate the guys around him at his new school, wheels up for Nico. But moving
100%.
on to 212, who you got at 212?
So to round out the second round, I'm gonna go Trey Wisner, running back out of Texas. He's a guy that's just like a big, powerful runner, and it's funny. He's one of those guys that like maybe people didn't expect him to be the RB1 at Texas, right? He had Jonathan Brooks, CJ Baxter, Jaden Blue, but every single season, like he's a guy that's just been consistent. He has had big time production. He has great vision, and I know there's that high end top speed might not be there. And, I do make a note that like I wish he could force more missed tackles, but he's just like Mr. Consistency, Mr. Reliable, and a guy that I think will get a lot of touches this year. And that 1-2 punch with Trey Wisner and CJ Baxter is going to be special at Texas, I think, this next season. So Arch Manning's going to be pretty happy having those two guys run the ball for him.
Yeah, and NFL GMs, they see Texas running back, and that's automatic. That's an automatic day 2 pick for them usually. So,
100%.
you can bet on him getting draft capital, and he's probably going to be a late second, early third type guy in Superflex Dynasty rookie drafts next season. Starting at 301, I think it's going to be Jaden, the Oklahoma running back transfer. He was a guy who was very productive at Cal as a freshman, also as a sophomore, and he kind of took a step down last year because of injury problems, but he wasn't healthy. And I think when he does get back healthy, he's going to have a huge bounce back season for the Oklahoma Sooners next year.
Yeah, and I think John Mateer will be excited to have him in the backfield, especially when he's healthy. A guy that's well-rounded and has lots of experience at the college level. So definitely excited to see what Jaden Ott does this next season. A guy that could maybe sneak into the second round. Going to 302, one of my favorite running backs, which I feel like I'm repeating myself a lot saying that, but it's all good because a lot of these guys are studs, being real. Justice Haynes, Alabama, transferred to Michigan, really aggressive runner and versatile. He's a guy that was a top prospect coming out of high school and then, carried the ball very efficiently and quite a few times with Alabama last season. Although Jam Miller was the primary running back there and he's still there this next season. But Justice Haynes moving to Michigan, I think, will be a good move for him to kind of be the clear RB1 there. A guy that I think just needs the chains kind of unleashed so he can really take over as the lead back.
Yeah, and he really hasn't done anything to dissuade, people who were high on him as a high school prospect because, he just hasn't gotten the volume. He's been efficient in a smaller sample size each of his seasons, at Alabama, but he just never took over that full workhorse role, which I think he can be forgiven for at a school like Alabama where they have so much talent in that
Totally.
backfield. So excited to see what he can do at Michigan. Moving on to 303, we got our first TCU wide receiver or player for that matter, and that's going to be Eric McAllister, the returning wide receiver. And there's no Jack Besh, no Savion Williams. A lot of targets just opened up, for Josh Hoover. And I think that Eric McAllister returning to that same offense with the same quarterback, it's going to be seamless and it's going to be a big step up in targets for him. And he's shown the talent, he's shown the efficiency throughout his career, right, Ethan?
Yeah, I mean, he was fourth in college football in yards per route run the last 2 seasons, and it doesn't surprise me. He was the second leading receiver at TCU last season, even above Savion Williams, who got drafted. He's a guy that can make the big plays, but also can make those awkward catches. He, has great ball awareness, and a guy that I think will have a really big year this next season if Josh Hoover keeps, feeding him the ball throughout the 2025 season.
Absolutely. Who you got at 304?
304, I'm going to go another wide receiver, shifty and speedy receiver, Eugene Wilson out of Florida. A guy that had a lot of freshman production, but had some injuries last season. And obviously, Florida's known for having some solid wide receivers too, so that wide receiver room's a little bit loaded. But he's a guy that just fits well in the slot, super shifty. Not the biggest guy, obviously, but is a guy that I think can really take over next season in the slot and just really produce. I mean, he produced really well as a true freshman last season with injury, still, in the few games that he played, had some solid numbers. So I think he's a guy that could have a big year this next season.
Yeah, and if you're a really lazy scout or Devy player and you want kind of like a cheat code, just look for freshman production in the SEC. And that's a pretty good, bet. Usually those guys pan out pretty well. Malik Neighbors, Brian Thomas Jr., the list goes on and on.
Jeremiah Smith, who's obviously not in NFL yet, but is going to be a big time prospect.
Exactly. Yeah. So Eugene Wilson, I think we're reaching that part of the draft where not all of these guys are sure bets to declare next year. There's a couple guys coming up, besides Eugene, who are not necessarily going to come out next year. They may come out in 27, but we got to put him in one class or the other, and I think there's a good shot that he does declare if he has a strong season, which I think he has a good shot to do that. As a returning more senior, player in that room. He's still young, obviously, but there's so much freshman talent in that receiving room that
Yeah.
Eugene's going to be, one of the leaders for the young guys. But anyways, I like that pick. And moving on to 305 is CJ Baxter, another guy who may or may not declare next year. He has some health concerns coming off an injury, just like Eugene Wilson. But Baxter's another highly rated prospect. He had a very good freshman season. He was going, in the first round of Devy drafts, as soon as a year ago. So he's a very highly rated guy himself, and I think the main question mark is his health and how much volume he's going to get competing with Trey Wisner in that backfield.
Yeah, I mean, he's a guy that, you check the box of that freshman production, and is a guy that, I think a lot of people thought was going to be the RB1 at Texas now that Jonathan Brooks was gone. And is a guy that, was getting more love than Jaden Blue, was getting more than love than Trey Wisner when, he was a freshman. So if it wasn't for that injury last season, I think he's a guy that, would be much, much, much higher on this list. And as you said, Garrett, I think it's true. Just because he has another good year next season doesn't necessarily mean he's going to declare. So we'll see. But obviously, if he does have a good season, then it might incentivize him to declare so he doesn't have a risk of another health injury.
Yeah, and even if not all of these guys, declare next year, I think it's still a deep enough class to where there's still going to be a lot of talented players on the board at this portion of the draft in the mid third round. So that's something to keep in mind for your trades. But after CJ Baxter, I think we expect Mendoza to go in this mid third range as well, and he could definitely sneak up draft boards into the late second or early third and pull a Tyler Shuck kind of rise. From not a lot of people are familiar with this kid, but he's very toolsy. He showed some impressive flashes, and he has some zip, on the ball coming out of his
100%.
hand. And he's transferring from Cal to Indiana, and not historically, football school or a big time program, but I think they're really trending up lately, right?
Yeah, I mean, the top 10 program last season at some point in the year. And I think Fernando Mendoza, who's a guy who has experience playing at, I guess now the ACC level with Cal, was Pac-12 and whatnot. A guy that made big jumps from his freshman to his sophomore year, a guy that has the frame too that you're looking for in a quarterback at 6'5", 230 pounds. So his efficiency's gone up, his kind of composure as a quarterback has improved, and he has the tools that I think could make him a quarterback that some NFL teams will be looking interested in the 2026 draft if he were to declare, right? So definitely excited to see what he does at Indiana, because that defense is solid. In fact, the defensive coordinator there, Brian Haynes, was one of my coaches when I played, which is pretty cool. So excited to see. I'm always rooting for Indiana for that reason, and I think Fernando Mendoza comes in there, being their clear QB1 will be a big boost for them. And I think the next pick that will pass it to you, Garrett, is another Indiana prospect that I think will be a perfect weapon to pair up with Fernando Mendoza.
Yeah, and I think both of these Indiana kids I think they're more highly regarded in NFL scout circles than they are in fantasy circles at the moment, in Devy circles. And, if you look at way too early mock drafts, from ESPN, from some of the bigger names in the industry, you'll see these guys, Elijah Sarratt, you'll see Fernando Mendoza pretty high on draft boards. And that's because they're pretty underrated, in the fantasy community. And if you can get a talent like Elijah Sarratt in the mid to late third round of your Dynasty SuperFlex Rookie Draft, I mean, that's killer value, man. He's 90.3 PFF returning receiving grade over the past 2 seasons. That's the best of all returning FBS receivers.
Yep.
He's also second of all returning receivers in receiving yards, with 2,156. So this is a guy who's being unheralded. He's being slept on for whatever reason. And I mean, just personally, when I watched the tape, his speed didn't jump off the tape, but I think speed is sometimes an overrated trait in wide receivers. So maybe a guy who's being, underestimated, not the sexiest, but just an absolute producer.
Yeah, and for me, a wide receiver, one thing that I look for in a successful wide receiver is that body awareness. Can you make a catch when the ball's not perfect? Can you have that, horizontal body making that big time catch when you need it? And Elijah Sarratt just, game after game, when watching his film, just like could make those awkward catches, could, get the high point, could get him down low, could get him across the middle. And, it doesn't surprise me that he was, one of the most efficient wide receivers in the past 2 seasons.
Yeah, just consistency is so big and availability, and this guy doesn't miss games, and he just, game in, game out, he's there for his quarterback, right where the quarterback needs him, and he's going to be Mendoza's best friend when he transfers
100%.
over there. So that'll be fun to watch. At 308, who you think goes in this range?
I think Quinten Joyner, running back from USC going to Texas Tech. He's a guy that's like super talented, really explosive runner, and he just has that like speed and power combo that is pretty rare in running backs. Like, he's not the biggest guy, but he's like stout, strong, really explosive. And, I know he took the backseat a little bit with behind Woody Marks at USC last year, but then now he's going to Texas Tech where Taj Brooks is no longer there. They fed him a lot. He's a guy that I think is going into a really good opportunity with that Texas Tech offense. And with his talent and his ability to, make people miss and have those big plays, I think he'll have a pretty successful year this next season.
Yeah, he's a fun talent, and he could step right into that Taj Brooks role, which is a lot of volume, man. So that would be fun to see. Let's cross our fingers that he gets the job, and keep an eye on him for next year. And if he does come out, he could be a big time sleeper. So I like Quinten Joyner. I also see Concepcion, and I know he's one of your guys as well. But he's a guy who really popped off the tape as a freshman. He was a big producer, big time numbers as a true freshman for NC State. And now he's transferring over to a SEC school in Texas A&M, and he's going to be playing with another underrated, talented player in Marcel Reed at quarterback. And I'm excited to see those two combine. And they're both guys who could be big time prospects in future draft classes. And I'm excited to see what he brings to that program, man, because I think they needed another weapon to go to the next level, and he could be
Yeah.
that guy.
Yeah, and you don't often see wide receivers who just like are willing to finish plays, to finish runs, and whether it's stiff arming guys to the ground or lowering his shoulder and just play after play. Casey Concepcion he was fighting for that extra yard, and he's not the biggest guy. I know there were some drop issues and some ball security issues, but I think he's a guy that will provide some swagger and some toughness to that Texas A&M wide receiver room.
Yeah, 309 too in the late third. I'll take that all day, man. That's great value.
Well, in this next pick too, I think people are going to be like, "Holy cow, he's super low." But 310 is going to be Carson Beck, quarterback, transfer from Georgia to Miami. Listen, I feel like a lot of people are sleeping on Carson Beck because last season, Georgia as a team wasn't as good as they were in the past, and his numbers weren't as good. But he still threw for over 3,400 yards. His touchdown to interception ratio was a little bit higher than it has been in the past. But like when you have such a dominant year in 2023, like he did with the Georgia Bulldogs when they had Brock Bowers, Ladd McConkey, and they were just a dominant defense, like there's going to be a little bit of a drop off. And I think a lot of people were, screaming, "Oh, Carson Beck is not as good as people say he was," just because his numbers, dipped a little bit. But Georgia as a team just wasn't as good also. Really excited to see him transfer to Miami though, because I think he needed kind of, a fresh new start. Miami is a really quarterback friendly offense. We saw what Cam Moore did there last season, right, Garrett?
Man, and I think he just got punished because people pushed him too high up draft boards after that season with Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey. I think people didn't really understand how good those two are. And when he lost both, I mean, he was considered the 101 coming into last season, right? I mean, he was the clear consensus 101 in NFL mock drafts, and he was expected to be just as good, even though he went from having Brock Bowers and Ladd McConkey to having neither of them and really no elite weapons, at wide receiver or tight end last year. So I think people kind of, they punish him a little too much, man. So
100%.
he could bounce back at Miami and be on that, Cam Ward trajectory potentially. So he's one to keep an eye on. And if he stays in this range, that'd be a great
Take him
great
all
value.
day. Yep.
Yeah, so at 311, another tight end. It's our third tight end, our only tight end that we expect, or our third tight end that we expect to go in, the top 3 rounds are only in the third round. That's Max Klare, and he transferred from Purdue to Ohio State. And I know Ohio State's more wide receiver you than tight end you, but Max Klare is a very good wide receiver, type type talent. They put him out wide, they line him up in the slot, and I think they could use him as a weapon at Ohio State. And I know he has quite a bit of target competition there, but I think that scouts will factor that in. And even if he doesn't put up huge numbers, if he puts up solid numbers and he shows off that talent on film, he could still be an early selection in next year's NFL draft.
Yeah, and I'm actually excited that he transferred to Ohio State where there is more target competition because he didn't really need to block a ton at Purdue because he was like one of their main receiving targets. And so I think that's one thing that kind of keeps him towards the end of the third round for me in the dynasty. And then I think, has him a little bit lower in the actual NFL draft because his blocking grades weren't super great last season in the running and pass blocking categories. And so I think now that there's a lot of weapons at Ohio State, like he's gonna block more for sure. And I think that's gonna be really valuable for him when, teams are looking at him as a prospect at the next level where no matter how good of a receiving threat you are as a tight end, like you're going to need to block. Like there's very few tight ends that can't block at all and are just elite receiving weapons. And so like they're like, okay, we'll take that chance. George Kittle has had successful careers because he's a good blocker. Gronkowski is a good blocker. You have these guys that can kind of do both of them. And I think Max Klare going to Ohio State will be forced into that role because he's not the number one guy anymore. You have two elite wide receivers that are going to be, the top two targets on the team. And so, he could fit in as that, third or fourth option. But I think it's going to be good for him just overall as an NFL prospect for him to have to kind of, block a little bit more than he did up. Rounding off the third round with the 12th pick, I'm going to go Le'Veon Moss, running back out of Texas A&M. He's a guy that was a little bit banged up in the spring, is coming off an injury, but reports have been saying that he looks healthy right now and is running at full speed. And man, this is a guy that, he ran a lot of outside zone at A&M, but when he hits the hole, he hits it hard. I mean, he's a physical runner. He's not afraid to run between the tackles. And, every year his production seems to improve. So that's definitely a guy that, at the end of the third round, who's going to be the lead back at Texas A&M, and that's a team that I think is going to be interesting because they've improved, in the offseason with some, in the transfer portal too. So Le'Veon Moss is a guy that recently was arrested for some sort of domestic dispute, but it sounds like it wasn't a super big deal. Some altercation with another guy or something like that. So I wouldn't raise too many red flags about that at this point. I think he's going to be the lead back at Texas A&M. Hopefully we'll have a big year coming off an injury and help lead that Texas A&M team to some success.
Yeah, and he's a guy who's been trending up. I mean, he was before the injury. It was such a shame when he got hurt, man, because he was really putting it together and turning into a top prospect in last year's draft. So if he can get healthy, I think he can be a sleeper in next year's class, and he'd be a hell of a get at the end of the third round in a in a dynasty rookie draft. But hope you guys enjoyed the content. Like and subscribe. We got more content headed your way. We're gonna break down some trades, break down some values for you guys, compare draft classes. Plenty of more content on the way. So stay locked in to Hive Sports.